On the morning of July 6, 1950, somewhere over the mountainous terrain of South Korea, a twin fuselage fighter aircraft descended through thick clouds into a landscape of war. At the controls sat Captain Ernest Charles Fiebelkorn, Red to those who knew him, a decorated World War II ace with 9 confirmed aerial victories, a man who had survived 66 combat missions over Nazi Germany, who had stared down Messerschmitt fighters and lived to tell the tale. He was 27 years old. He had a radio observer beside him, a young lieutenant named John Higgins. They were searching for a forward air controller, hunting for enemy tanks that had broken through United Nations lines. The weather was terrible. Visibility was nearly zero. The mountains below were hidden beneath a blanket of clouds, and then silence. The other pilots in his flight, circling above the overcast, heard nothing more. No distress call. No final transmission. Just the empty static of a radio frequency that would never carry Red Fiebelkorn's voice again. For 3 years, no one would know where he fell. No one would find the wreckage. No one would recover the remains of the man who had once been untouchable in the skies over Europe. This is the story of a hero who survived history's deadliest air war, only to vanish in the opening days of a conflict the world would come to call the Forgotten War. This is the story of what it means to disappear and what it takes to be found. Ernest Charles Fiebelkorn Jr. was born on December 12, 1922, in Pontiac, Michigan, in an era when the country was still finding its footing after the Great War. He grew up in Lake Orion, a small town where everyone knew everyone, where boys played baseball in empty lots and families gathered on front porches in the summer heat. His father, Ernest Sr., worked construction, doing whatever was necessary to keep food on the table for his wife and 5 children. Red, so nicknamed for the color of his hair, that bright copper that caught the light, was one of those children, a boy who looked up at the sky and wondered what it would be like to touch the clouds. But in 1936, when Red was just 13 years old, his father fell from a roof. The injuries were catastrophic. Ernest Sr. died from complications, leaving his widow alone to raise 5 children in the depths of the Great Depression. There was no safety net, no insurance payout that would make everything okay. Just a mother doing her best, and children who learned early what it meant to lose someone you loved. Red carried that loss with him. He learned what it meant to be the man of the house when you were still just a boy. He learned about responsibility, about sacrifice, about doing what needed to be done, even when the weight of it felt too heavy to bear. By 1941, Red had enrolled at Michigan State College, trying to build a future for himself, trying to become something more than the son of a construction worker who fell from a roof. He studied. He dreamed. He imagined a life where he wouldn't have to worry about making ends meet. But then on a Sunday morning in December, the world changed. Pearl Harbor was attacked. America went to war. And Red Fiebelkorn, like so many young men of his generation, made a choice. In May of 1942, he left college. He walked away from his education, from the promise of a degree and a comfortable life, and he enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces. He wanted to fly. The training was brutal. 15 months of relentless instruction, of learning how to take a machine made of metal and rivets and make it dance through the sky, of mastering the physics of flight and the psychology of combat. There were men who washed out, who couldn't handle the pressure or the danger or the sheer physical demands of becoming a fighter pilot. Red was not one of them. On August 30th, 1943, at Williams Army Airfield in Arizona, he was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. They pinned silver wings on his chest. He was a pilot now. He was going to war. In January of 1944, Red arrived in England, assigned to the 20th Fighter Group, 77th Fighter Squadron. The skies over Europe were a killing field. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's Air Force, was still a formidable opponent, filled with experienced pilots flying some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. Red's first missions were flown in the P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that looked like something from a science fiction novel. It was fast, it was deadly, and it was unforgiving. But Red learned. He adapted. He became good at the one thing that mattered most in aerial combat, staying alive. In July of 1944, the 20th Fighter Group transitioned to the P-51 Mustang. The the sleek, beautiful fighter that would become the legend of the war. With its long range and superior performance, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It could dogfight with anything the Luftwaffe put in the sky. And in the hands of a pilot like Red Fiebelkorn, it was lethal. September 28, 1944. The mission was a bomber escort to Magdeburg, deep in the heart of Germany. Red's flight encountered a formation of Luftwaffe fighters, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s, the backbone of German air defense. What happened next would be talked about for years. Red engaged. He maneuvered, he fired. One Bf 109 went down, then another, then a third. Then a Fw 190. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission. He had nearly achieved ace-in-a-day status, a feat so rare that most pilots would never come close. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Silver Star, one of the nation's highest decorations for valor. On November 2, 1944, over Leipzig, he did it again. 3 more enemy aircraft destroyed. Another Silver Star. Red Fiebelkorn was becoming known not just in his squadron, but throughout the 20th Fighter Group. He was the man you wanted on your wing. He was the pilot who saw things before they happened, who reacted faster, who shot straighter. On November 8, 1944, he added one more victory to his tally. A shared credit for shooting down a Messerschmitt Me-262, one of the world's first operational jet fighters. By the end of the war, Red's official score stood at 9 aerial victories, 7 Bf 109s, 1.5 Fw 190s, and half an Me-262. He was the top ace of the 20th Fighter Group. On October 6, 1944, Red was selected for something unusual. He appeared on an American Broadcasting System radio broadcast from London, alongside Countess Mountbatten, where he recounted his combat experiences to audiences back home. For a brief moment, he was famous. He was the all-American hero, the small-town boy from Michigan who had gone to war and become an ace. People listened to his voice crackling over the radio, and they felt hope. They felt pride, but Red never stopped being the boy from Lake Orion, the kid who lost his father too young. He completed 66 combat missions over Europe. 66 times he climbed into the cockpit of a fighter plane and flew into hostile skies, knowing that every mission could be his last. 66 times he came home. On February 9, 1947, after the war ended and the celebrations faded, Red left active duty. He was 24 years old. He had seen more death and destruction than most people would see in a lifetime. He tried to find peace. But peace for men like Red Fiebelkorn was elusive. On December 2, 1947, less than 2 years after leaving the service, Red was recalled to active duty. The world was changing. The Soviet Union was becoming a threat. Tensions were rising. The military needed experienced pilots, and Red Fiebelkorn was one of the best. He was assigned to the 2nd Fighter Squadron at Mitchell Field in New York, then to the 82nd Fighter Squadron at Hamilton Air Force Base in California. In April of 1949, he was sent to Naha Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, joining the 4th Fighter Squadron of the 51st Fighter Group. This time, he wasn't flying a P-51 Mustang. He was transitioning to something new, the F-82 Twin Mustang. It was an unusual aircraft, essentially 2 P-51 fuselages joined together by a central wing and tail section, with a pilot in the left fuselage and a radar observer in the right. It was designed for long-range escort missions and all-weather interception. It was big, it was powerful, and it required a different kind of flying than Red was used to. But he learned. He always learned. By the summer of 1950, Red had been promoted to captain. He was 27 years old. He had a decade of military experience. He was a leader, a flight commander, someone that younger pilots looked up to. He had everything ahead of him. And then on June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The Korean War had begun. Within days, American forces were being rushed to the peninsula. The initial response was chaotic, desperate. The North Korean army was well equipped and highly motivated, and they were pushing south with terrifying speed. The South Korean military was collapsing. The handful of American troops on the ground were outnumbered and outgunned. In the air, pilots like Red Fiebelkorn were among the first to respond. They flew reconnaissance missions, ground attack missions, anything to slow the North Korean advance. The F-82 Twin Mustang, with its long-range and all-weather capability, was invaluable in those early days. Red and his radar observer, First Lieutenant John Joseph Higgins, flew mission after mission. They strafed enemy positions. They hunted for tanks and trucks and troop concentrations. They did everything they could to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. But the weather in Korea was brutal. Summer brought monsoons, thick clouds, torrential rain. Flying was dangerous even without enemy fire. Mountains jutted up from the landscape like the teeth of some great beast, hidden beneath clouds, waiting to trap the unwary. Pilots flew low, trying to find targets, trying to avoid colliding with terrain they couldn't see. The risk was constant. The stress was immense. Red had survived 66 missions over Nazi Germany. He had faced the Luftwaffe at the height of its power. He had been shot at by some of the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. He had always come home. Korea would be different. The briefing came on very short notice. 4 F-82 Twin Mustangs from the 68th Fighter Interceptor Squadron would launch immediately for the Suwon-Seoul area. The mission: contact a forward air controller and receive instructions for a ground attack mission. North Korean tanks had broken through United Nations lines. They needed to be stopped. Captain Ernest Fiebelkorn would lead the flight. His radar observer would be First Lieutenant John Higgins. It was early in the morning. The weather was terrible. Low clouds covered the entire target area, a thick undercast that obscured the ground. Below those clouds was mountainous terrain, invisible, deadly. It was the kind of weather where you didn't fly unless you absolutely had to. They had to. The 4 F-82s took off and headed west, toward the battle. It was a long flight, over hostile territory, through weather that would make a lesser pilot turn back. But Red Fiebelkorn had never turned back. The flight reached the Suwon-Seoul area and began trying to establish radio contact with the forward air controller. They needed coordinates. They needed to know where the enemy tanks were. They needed to know where friendly forces were so they wouldn't accidentally strafe their own troops. But the radio was silent. No response from the controller. The 4 F-82s circled above the clouds, burning fuel, waiting for instructions that never came. They tried different frequencies. They called and called, nothing. Below them, somewhere in that sea of white, was a war. Men were fighting and dying. Tanks were advancing, and 4 fighter aircraft, each carrying enough firepower to stop a column of armor, were circling uselessly in the sky because they couldn't find the target. Red made a decision. He told his flight that he was descending through the clouds. He was going to try to break through the undercast, get below the weather, find the enemy tanks himself. It was voluntary. No one ordered him to do it. He didn't have to. He could have turned back, conserved his fuel, returned to base, and waited for the weather to clear. That would have been the safe choice. That would have been the reasonable choice. But Red Fiebelkorn had never chosen the safe path. The other pilots in his flight watched as his F-82 nosed down, disappearing into the clouds. They listened on the radio, waiting for him to call out, to report that he had broken through, that he could see the ground. They waited to hear that he was engaging the enemy, that he had found the tanks, that the mission was successful. They heard nothing. Minutes passed. They called his name over the radio. "Red, do you copy?" Silence. "Captain Fiebelkorn, report your position." Static. The 3 remaining F-82s continued to circle, their pilots growing increasingly worried. Something was wrong. Red should have responded by now. Even if he hadn't found the enemy, even if he had decided to climb back up through the clouds, he should have said something. But there was only silence. Eventually, running low on fuel, the 3 F-82s had to return to base. They landed and reported what had happened. Captain Fiebelkorn and Lieutenant Higgins were missing. Their aircraft had disappeared into the clouds near Chongmongni, in Pungmyon, approximately 40 miles north of Seoul. No distress call had been received. No emergency beacon had been detected. They were simply gone. Search and rescue efforts were launched, but the weather remained terrible, and the area where Red had disappeared was deep in enemy-held territory. North Korean forces controlled the ground. Flying low to search for wreckage would have been suicide. Days passed, then weeks. No sign of the F-82, no sign of Captain Fiebelkorn or Lieutenant Higgins. They were officially classified as missing in action. Back in the United States, Red's family received the dreaded telegram. Missing in action. Not killed, not captured, missing, which meant there was hope. Maybe he had survived the crash. Maybe he had been taken prisoner. Maybe somehow he would come home. But the months turned into years and there was no news. No reports from prisoner of war camps. No sightings. No intelligence suggesting that Red Feeblecorn was alive. Missing in action became a kind of limbo, a place where hope and grief existed in equal measure, where a family couldn't move on because they didn't know if there was anything to move on from. For Red's mother, the woman who had already lost her husband, the news was devastating. She had sent her son off to war twice, first to Europe, then to Korea. Both times she had prayed for his safe return. The first time her prayers had been answered. He had come home. But the second time, there was only silence. In Lake Orion, Michigan, people remembered Red. They remembered the boy with the bright red hair who used to play in the streets, who had lost his father too young, who had gone off to become a hero. They remembered listening to his voice on the radio, coming all the way from London, talking about shooting down German fighters. They remembered being proud that one of their own had done something so extraordinary. Now they gathered in churches and prayed for his return. They held out hope that somehow, impossibly, he would come walking back into town with that easy smile, ready to tell another story about the skies and the battles he had fought. But the months passed, and hope began to fade. In the military, Red Feeblecorn's name went on a list. Missing in action. One of thousands of American service members who had vanished in Korea, who had been swallowed up by the war and never found. The fighting continued. The front lines shifted back and forth. The mountainous terrain where Red had disappeared changed hands multiple times. Sometimes it was controlled by UN forces, sometimes by North Korean or Chinese forces. It was brutal, chaotic, a landscape of destruction. By 1953, the war was winding down. Armistice negotiations were underway. The killing would soon stop. But for thousands of families, the war would never truly end. Their loved ones were still missing, still unaccounted for, still somewhere out there in the mountains and valleys of Korea. And then, in 1953, a recovery team found something. They found the wreckage on a mountainside near Chongmong-ni, exactly where Red's flight had last reported hearing from him. The F-82 twin Mustang had impacted the terrain at high speed. There was very little left that was recognizable as an aircraft, just twisted metal, burned components, pieces scattered across the rocky slope. The impact had been catastrophic. Whoever was inside would have died instantly. The recovery team carefully searched the crash site, looking for any trace of the two men who had been aboard. They found human remains. Not much. The crash and the intervening years had not been kind, but enough. Enough for identification. Enough to bring them home. Captain Ernest Charles Feeblecorn Jr. and First Lieutenant John Joseph Higgins had been found. The remains were carefully recovered, documented, and prepared for transport back to the United States. After 3 years of uncertainty, after 3 years of hoping and praying and not knowing, their families finally had an answer. It wasn't the answer they had prayed for. It wasn't the miracle they had hoped for. But it was closure. It was the end of the waiting. The military officially changed Red's status from missing in action to killed in action. His death was dated July 6, 1950, the day he had descended into the clouds and never returned. He had been 27 years old. Red Feeblecorn came home to a nation that was already trying to forget the war he had died in. Korea had been messy, complicated, unsatisfying. There had been no clear victory, no triumphant return, no ticker-tape parades. It was the forgotten war, and the men who fought in it were in danger of being forgotten too. But Red would not be forgotten. His remains were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, that hallowed ground overlooking the Potomac River, where America's heroes rest. There was a flag-draped coffin. There was a military honor guard. There were volleys of rifle fire and the mournful sound of taps played by a lone bugler. There was a grieving mother who had now outlived both her husband and her son. There were siblings who remembered a boy with red hair who had always looked up at the sky. Red's headstone was placed among thousands of others, simple and white, bearing his name, his rank, his dates of birth and death. It noted his service in World War II and Korea. It noted his decorations, 2 silver stars, the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, the Air Medal with oak leaf clusters. It was a record of a life lived in service, of a man who had answered his country's call not once but twice, who had survived the deadliest air war in history only to die in a conflict the world would struggle to remember. For his final mission, that voluntary descent through the clouds, that last attempt to find the enemy and complete the mission, Red was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor. The citation read, "In part, Captain Feeblecorn made a voluntary descent through dangerous undercast over mountainous terrain in a final attempt to locate and engage the enemy. His actions exemplified courage and selfless devotion to duty." Selfless devotion to duty. That was what they called it when a man flew into clouds knowing he might not come out. That was what they called it when a pilot put the mission above his own safety. When he descended into a landscape he couldn't see because somewhere down there, friendly forces needed help. That was what they called it when a hero died. Today, if you visit Arlington National Cemetery, you can find Red Feeblecorn's grave. You can stand before that simple white headstone and read his name. You can think about a boy from Michigan who lost his father too young, who left college to fight in a war, who became an ace pilot with 9 aerial victories, who survived 66 missions over Nazi Germany, who was recalled to duty and sent to Korea, and who vanished into the clouds on a July morning in 1950. You can think about the 3 years his family waited, not knowing if he was alive or dead, holding on to hope even as that hope grew fainter with each passing day. You can think about the moment they learned the truth, the moment the waiting ended and the grieving began. You can think about what it means to serve, to sacrifice, to put duty above safety, mission above survival. Ernest Charles Feeblecorn Jr. was a hero in every sense of the word. He was decorated for valor, not once but multiple times. He was a skilled pilot, a leader, a man who inspired those around him. He could have done so many things with his life. He could have finished college, found a career, raised a family, grown old, but he chose a different path. He chose to serve. He chose to fly. And when the moment came, when the weather was terrible and the mission was dangerous and the smart thing to do would have been to turn back, he chose to descend through those clouds, to complete the mission, to do what needed to be done. Red Feeblecorn's story is not a crime story. There was no villain, no murderer, no conspiracy. But it is a tragedy. It is the story of a young man whose life was cut short, of a family that never got to say goodbye, of a mother who buried her son. It is the story of war and what war takes from us. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War, but the men who fought in it should not be forgotten. Red Feeblecorn should not be forgotten. He deserves to be remembered, not just as a name on a headstone or a statistic in a history book, but as a real person who lived and loved and dreamed and died, doing what he believed was right. On July 6, 1950, Red Feeblecorn descended into the clouds over Chongmong-ni, South Korea. He never came back. But his courage, his dedication, his selfless devotion to duty, those things endure. They are carved into that white headstone at Arlington. They are remembered by those who study military history, who honor veterans, who understand that freedom is never free. Red Feeblecorn was 27 years old when he died. He was an ace pilot, a decorated hero, a son, a brother, a leader. He was a boy from Michigan with bright red hair who looked up at the sky and dreamed of flying. He flew higher and farther than most people ever will. And when the moment came when duty called, he answered. He flew into the clouds and into history, into the ranks of those who gave everything for their country. This is his story. This is his legacy. Red Feeblecorn, the ace who vanished over Korea, will not be forgotten.